Oh.
Hello, everyone.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes.
Welcome,
everyone, to the 5th talk in our International Philosophy Talk series held by the Department of Philosophy at Marmara University, Istanbul, Turkey. Today, we are honored to have Professor Galen Strawson with us, and his talk is entitled Meaning in Life and Narrativity. I will first give a very brief introduction. Professor Galen Strawson taught at Oxford University from 1979 to 2000, and at Reading University from 2001 to 2012. Since 2012, he has been the President's Chair of Philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. He has various publications. Among them, I'm just going to list some of his books. His books include Freedom and Belief, 1986, published in 1986, The Secret Connection, Realism, Causation, and David Hume, 1989, Mental Reality, 1994, Selves, 2009. And I should add here, actually, on a personal note, I was fortunate enough to be in Professor Galen Strawson's class when he visited New York at the City University of New York. And I believe we were actually having discussions on an earlier draft of this book, the Selves book.
Correct.
Yeah. His other books include Locke on Personal Identity, Consciousness, and Concernment, 2011. I actually use this book in my classes, especially the appendix part where you provide that contemporary modern English version, right, which really helps my students.
Great.
Yeah. Continuing on with books, The Evident Connection, Human Personal Identity, 2011, The Subject of Experience, 2017, and Things That Bother Me, Death, Freedom, and Self in 2018. So please join me in welcoming Professor Galen Strawson. The floor, I guess, is virtually yours, and thank you again for participating in our Philosophy Talk series.
Thanks very much. I'm very pleased to be here wherever I am. I'm not sure where I am. Yes, I remember that class in the CUNY Graduate Center. I think at one point we were discussing a paper I had, and it got to be called the Mad Paper. I don't know whether Sinef remembers that. But
I actually remember a very funny quotation from that class. I remember you saying, I can't believe we get to discuss this in a room full of people, and I get to be paid for it, you see.
Yeah, that sounds quite plausible, yeah. Okay, so I mean, some of you will know I've written on narrativity before. I get asked to do it from time to time, and this is slightly embarrassing because I've written quite a few papers and they overlap quite a lot. And so this time there's going to be an Oxford Handbook of the meaning of meaning in life. And so, I agreed, but perhaps I shouldn't have. But anyway, this is what came out of that. And I hope you've all got, I hope everyone's received the PDF, because I hope that you can have it up on one side of your screen and set it to scrolling, because I find that's better than sharing screen. Has anyone not got a copy of the PDF that they can look at? It's just a handout. I mean, if you haven't, I'm sure you'll survive, but
I did not get it.
Oh, well, it has to be put into the chat to be picked up. But if you were joined, I wonder whether someone can put it back in the chat another time. Yes, here we go. Someone's going to put it in the chat again. You should be able to pick it up.
Okay.
Oh, hello, Rohit. I have to say hello to Rohit. And I have to, okay. Good. So it's usually the question of the meaning of life. And I think it's almost a commonplace now in analytic philosophy that that's not a good question. I've always found that it just makes my mind go blank. and I want to say none. But then I imagine someone saying, you've got to give a positive answer. So, but I didn't want to change my mind, but I decided that the answer none, or the answer it has no meaning, is actually a positive answer. It's celebratory. It's the only thing that adequately conveys the value of life. It doesn't have meaning. It has value independently of whatever it might be for it to have meaning. Of course, the question is often rephrased as what's the point or purpose of life? But this to me seems like the question, what is the point or purpose of the universe? And I want to reply, being someone with no religious belief, that it has none, it just is. And again, I want to suggest that has a positive, can be taken positively. Any other answer would diminish what Camus called the implacable grandeur of life and the universe. I do know that, I mean, because I read Islamic studies as a very young man, I know that one theory is that God created the universe because he wished to be known. But if I think that God is the universe, then I can't say that. Okay, so I think the existence of the universe may have value, but I don't think it has meaning. It's just not a good word. I mean, really, the word meaning is a word we use to apply to statements. And it makes my mind go blank. So the mind blanking question isn't Socrates' famous question, which was, how should one live? Someone might say, though, if you could give a positive answer to the question, what is the meaning of life, might it help with answering Socrates' question? And I just don't know, is what I would say to that. But anyway, now is the time to replace of with in, and to ask what is meaning in life. And it's widely agreed that this is a good move, and I follow Susan Wolf here. Well, I'm just going to call meaning in life, meaning with a capital M, but you can't hear a capital M. I could pronounce it meaning star, but I think you just have to know from now on that when I say meaning, I mean meaning in life. And I was set a particular question in contributing to this Oxford handbook, which was, what's the connection between meaning and narrative or narrativity? Or rather, many say that you need narrativity to have meaning. Is this true? Well, we'd need to know what narrativity is before we can know what meaning is, if it's true. So I'm just going to go through, what is narrativity? What do I mean by that? And I use narrativity too with a capital N, which you won't be able to hear. I use it as a name for a psychological trait, not for, as it were, a formal feature of a novel or something. It's a psychological trait. So to be narrative, in my definition, is to be someone, to be like this, that there's a fundamental respect in which one naturally experiences or conceives of one's life as having the form of a story, or perhaps a collection of stories, and in some manner you live in and through this conception. Well, what's it like to live like that? Well, I don't know. I just draw a blank there, but many people think they do know, and because of that, I'm going to take the basic viability of the notion for granted. And I have a great set of quotations that I always use at this point, just to, as it were, illustrate it without trying to define it further. I've got a few new ones here, but there's a man called John Davenport who's written influentially on this. And here's what he says: each person's individual identity is or depends on an understanding he has of his life in narrative form as a development from his past towards his future prospects, ending in his death. So this is the kind of the grand scale picture that you have to think of your life as a whole. He's a Kierkegaard scholar, and I think that he's being influenced there by Kierkegaard. But I do think Kierkegaard's view on what the world is not to be emulated. So I cannot imagine what it's like to live like that, but Davenport has a lot of support, and here are some quotations I've used in several papers before. So Oliver Sacks, a very intelligent and interesting clinical neuropsychologist. He says, each of us constructs and lives a narrative, and I quote, "This narrative is us, our identities." Alistair McIntyre, we all live out narratives in our lives and understand our own lives in terms of the narratives that we live out. Charles Taylor, we must inescapably understand our lives in narrative form. Here's an article co-authored by 3 people, and Dan McAdams is some say the doyen, the leading social psychologist who writes about narrative. And he says, we are all storytellers and we are the stories we tell. Now you could, we're philosophers. Are we to take that as a metaphysical claim? We are the stories we tell. Anyway, there it is. Ricoeur, very distinguished French proponent of the narrative way of life. He says life is an activity and a passion in search of a narrative. I have one from Charles Simic. We make sense of our lives not just by ferreting out the facts, but by turning them into stories, so we can bring past events to life. I don't do that. Jerry Bruner, self is a perpetually rewritten story. In the end, we become the autobiographical narratives by which we tell about our lives. So here we have a shared view. First is that narrativity is psychologically inevitable for human beings. And second, that most of them also think that it's essential to a good life. So there's an ethical component there. Maria Schechtman is a very interesting philosopher writing about this. She says a very strong statement, which she has since modified, I should say. She says a person creates his identity only by forming an autobiographical narrative, a story of his life. And Richard Kearney adapts Socrates' famous remark that the unexamined life is not worth living. He changes it to the unnarrated life is not worth living. Who's the most famous opponent? It's Jean-Paul Sartre. And again, I have a well-known quotation. He says that a man is always a human being, really is the correct translation, is always a teller of stories. They live surrounded by their own stories and those of other people. They see everything that happens to them in terms of these stories, and they try to live their life as if they were recounting it. But he says one has to choose to live or to tell stories. So for Sartre, narrativity is anti-life. It's inevitable bad faith or mauvaise foi. I've got quite a long list of quotations here. I hope you're not getting tired of them. Julian Barnes, a friend of mine, he talks of the narratives we turn our lives into, and the clear implication that it's a problem that we do that. And then Iris Murdoch. I like to say that I'm a Murdochian in ethics. She says, man in the generic sense is a creature who makes pictures of himself and then comes to resemble the picture. But for her, this is bad. It's a large part of the reason why, I quote, the self, the place where we live, is a place of illusion. So for her, narrativity might be a fecund source of meaning, but it's likely to be junk meaning. Okay, well, narrativity usually involves taking up a relatively large-scale perspective on your life, but from looking around at the people I know, and I have to say many of my best friends are extremely narrative people. Some people live their lives more like a weekly installment in a comic or something like that. Another thought about narrativity is that it effectively involves taking up some kind of second or third personal stance to oneself. This has now got a name derived from the Latin. Some people call this illeism. I think that's from the contrast in Latin between hic, as you were here and this, and ille, there and that. And you might think you might think I have an opportunity for a criticism here, saying, oh, to go second or third person on yourself is alienating. But actually, I don't think that. I think there can be value in, as it were, going to second or third person with respect to oneself. In fact, it's a way of being with oneself. So Okay, I think I'll skip this delightful quotation from Robert Burns, which is in Scottish. You can probably understand it, but it's an interesting thought that he thinks that it would be great if we could see ourselves in the way other people see us. I'm hearing some interference. Is it okay? Okay? Can people hear?
Yes,
Raise
it's
your
okay.
hand. Okay, I heard some voice talking. So Burns thinks it would be very good for us to know what other people think of us, because we would have an inflated picture of ourselves. But it is actually the case that some people are the other way around. They're self-deprecating. They think worse of themselves than other people. And for them too, it would be a good thing for them to know to take up the external point of view. I guess Bridget Jones is perhaps an example of that. I'm not sure if she's a good one. Okay, I'm going to move on from, I have a nice quotation from Emerson, but the point of that quotation is he's someone who, and I think I used to be like this, very like this, that every 2 weeks or so, there'd be some idea that would be kind of the dominant idea in my life by which I saw things, but then 2 or 3 weeks later, I would have moved on to something else. So this would be, as it were, the changing weekly version of narrativity. So that's all that by way of an initial indirect attempt to point at what it is. But I now want to offer what are 8 platitudes. All these platitudes are sometimes offered in support of the view that we are all naturally narrative. And my argument is going to be that they are indeed platitudes. That is, they're true. They're all true. But I think that narrativity must be something more than that. So here we go. First one, I just call it Locke, because it's the fact that all ordinary people fulfill the fundamental condition stated in Locke's famous definition of a person. That is, they can consider themselves as themselves, the same thinking thing in different times and places. That is, we're all fully self-conscious, all normal adult human beings, and our self-consciousness has a significant temporal extent. We can think to the past and the future. As a side note, actually, it's interesting that there are cases of brain lesions where people are still self-conscious, but they have no appreciable temporal extent at all. They live almost entirely in the present, but they're still self-conscious. So they would not fulfill one of Locke's 2 subconditions. So we're all self-conscious and we have some sense of our past and future. Number 2, self-history. We all have some reasonably good grasp of basic facts about our own lives. We have what I call a more or less adequate self-history or self-chronicle. That said, some people don't. They are so wrapped up in false memory that they can no longer really be said to know much about their own lives. It's an important fact. Therefore, I've got, just for the sake of history, Leibniz here saying some people come to believe their own stories by constantly repeating them. So it's not as if this is a new, exciting new 20th century discovery in experimental psychology. And Hume, liars by the frequent repetition of their lives come at last to believe and remember them as realities. This is just a true fact about us, very disturbing, and again, I think there would be huge individual difference there. Some people do, some people don't. So, but to go back, we almost all do have a pretty good sense of our basic facts of our life, when we went to university and so on. Now, 3 I call timeline, and that's, well, it's also called Dante, and that's just that we all know how old we are. I said these were platitudes, right? We know more or less, we're pretty clear about where we are on the standard timeline of human life between birth and death. It may or may not matter to us, but we do. So this is a very, very basic fact about us. And the point of all these is that someone might say, well, that just shows that you're narrative. And I'm going to say, no, it doesn't. If you want to say that it is enough, well, then your notion of narrative is no longer interesting to me, something like that. 4, Another mega platitude. One thing leads to another in life in a highly regular fashion. And we know this in detail. 5 to 7 just expand on that. Explanation. Explanation, causal knowledge, causal explanation is fundamental to our lives. It almost invariably involves temporal order. It's an understanding of how one thing leads to another, connects to another. And again, someone say, well, that's narrative. But I say, no, it isn't. It's just causal stuff. Okay, 6, psychology. I'll read this out in full because a vast number of crucial facts about our lives are, of course, facts about our psychological states, our hopes, our fears, beliefs, desires, and so on. Vast numbers of these psychological states involve awareness of connections between past and future, in particular past and future parts of one's own life. And vast numbers of these psychological states are crucially involved in the vast numbers of regular sequences and processes that structure our lives. And here, this is wholly platitudinous because it means things like, well, I want to make some coffee, so I know where the coffee is, so I go and get it, and then I turn on the kettle or something. 7, another expansion of the platitude. Vast numbers of these sequences and processes in our lives play out as they do because of psychological states just mentioned. And of course, most of them involve intentional action. And almost all intentional action involves anticipation, thinking ahead, planning, calculation of possible consequences, what-if thinking, thinking that has causal and temporal and psychological matters as part of its content. And we engage in such thinking all the time. Finally, temporality, which doesn't add much to what we have. We all experience ourselves temporally, simply in living from moment to moment, making coffee, going downstairs, even when we're completely absorbed and living in the moment. So I put it to you that all those things are true, and in fact, obviously true about human life. And my claim is, and this is where you can jump off the argument, if you like, is that this doesn't imply that we're narrative, because I would say those things are true of me, but that I'm not narrative. We could then argue about what it is to be narrative. Narrativity, I suggest, must be something over and above these things. After all, the idea that human beings are fundamentally narrative was meant to be a great recent insight. But if any combination of 1 to 8 is enough for narrative, then it's entirely banal. Question. What does narrative, well, that's really enough about narrative. That's sketching it in. So what does it have to do with meaning in life? Is either of them either integral to or necessary or sufficient for the other? Well, I don't think so. But what do I mean by meaning? And capital M, meaning in life. I don't mean value. And I don't mean point or purpose. I just want to put aside those natural moves to provide an alternative account of what we mean by meaning. I would say if you want to talk about point or purpose in life, just use the words point and purpose. You can agree that meaning doesn't mean point or purpose and still hold that meaning is created by having such a point or purpose. And that's what a lot of people do. But there's something right about that, and I'll quote Susan Wolf later, her well-known 2-line definition. But I do think already that to think that meaning is created by point or purpose, valuable point or purpose, is inadequate, because meaning in life, whatever exactly it's meant to be, I think it can be most intense precisely when there is no point or purpose in the offing. That's not what you're about at that moment. And I'm thinking, among other things, of aesthetic experience and of Kant's view about that. So I'm just going to take a different approach and try and pair meaning with something else. And I'm going to propose that meaning in life has got something essentially to do with being interesting. And I'll just call that interest. And again, it's got a capital I. If you've got the handout, of course, you can see the capital I. So my first claim. Meaning implies interest. This is definitional here. Interest has surely got to be necessary for meaning. By the way, don't say that something boring is meaningful, because of course, of course it is. It couldn't be boring unless it had meaning. But this is meaning with a capital M, and we're trying to get at what this augmented sense of meaning might be. So meaning implies interest, and I think also the converse. Interest implies meaning. If it's interesting, it has meaning in the richer than basic sense. So I get a biconditional, and that suggests, although it doesn't entail, that they're the same thing. So perhaps in my new definition now, what I'm talking about as meaning in life is just interestingness. The question, if that's right, then the question is, what's the relation between narrativity and meaning becomes what's the relation between narrative and interestingness of life. Well, from now on, I'm just going to assume that when we're looking for meaning, we're looking at interestingness, and I'm just going to see what follows. Okay. For does build in two, of course. It entails two, and that clashes with the standard belief that a life with high meaning will be a life that we judge to be a good life in the Socratic sense, but I think that's not true. So I'm opposing any normative conception of meaning that thinks that meaning in life has to be something good, as you will see. So what is the relation between narrativity and meaning equals interest? Well, I think there's no necessary relation. I think you can live a fabulously interesting and profoundly picaresque life with no natural thought of one's life as a narrative or developmental story. I think of some of you may have read things by Bruce Chatwin. I think he comes to my mind, and to my mind comes one of my adolescent heroes. Well, he's still one of my heroes, Nasruddin Hoxha. I believe he's definitely Turkish, right? Unlike Rumi, who I believe came from Tabriz. I don't know if any of you know the lovely books by Idris Shah. Do any of you know those? With telling some of the stories of Mullah Nasruddin. Good. Okay, so I think he's obviously had a very good life, even when he was looking for a key under the light because he dropped it somewhere in the dark. Okay, so narrativists are going to say, no, they're going to say, you can't have interest without narrativity. I'm saying no to that. I've just said no to that. What about the converse? Sorry, that was my son, who's a member of the British Antarctic Survey, just flashing a message at me about some ice core in the Antarctic that he's examining. See, that's part of the happenstance of life. Okay, what about narrativity requires interest or meaning? Well, they don't have to think that, but I've actually, a well-known type of counterexample in this literature is Sisyphus. So I have Sisyphus the bored, who could be profoundly narrative type without his life being interesting to him or anyone. I mean, what a misery. Where is the narrative arc in Sisyphus's life? He just goes on and on, pushing the stone up the hill and it rolling down again. Poor guy. Better not to be narrative. So I'm suggesting we have what psychologists call a double dissociation, that narrativity and meaning each of them can exist without the other. Well, maybe, but can narrative increase interest and increase meaning? Well, no doubt. No doubt it can. And although I have a kind of polemic here, I'm very aware that there are people for whom it is truly natural and I would think right for them to live in the narrative fashion. My objection is only to the empirical claim that everyone does it and the normative claim that we ought to do it. So can it increase interest and therefore meaning? Well, yes, but it could also decrease it. So again, actually, I've just said this. Sisyphus the bored might be far better off without a constant, vivid narrative awareness of the terrible sameness of his life. He should follow Epictetus, or again, Hodja, but I don't think Hodja is going to help him very much in this case. It might do. I mean, maybe Hodja can transcend the terribleness of Sisyphus's life, because Epictetus is famous because he said the way to be free in some sense is just not ever to want something you can't have. Okay. Next suggestion. Might narrativity on the whole increase interest? Well, I think that's possible. If you've got a kind of good story naturally running for yourself about yourself and your life, it might make it kind of interesting. Well, suppose it did usually increase interest. Would that be a point in its favor? Well, I doubt it, because even if interest is a good thing, all other things being equal, it can easily be a bad thing. Because first thought, narrativity could be the more interesting, the more it involves self-deception. I mean, you might have a fantasy about your life, terribly interesting, but just not true. And I think self-deception is rarely, if ever, a good thing. Some of you might know that there was a very influential psychology article once called About Positive Illusion, and it said that having a positive illusion could make your life a better life. But on the whole, I think it's best to face the truth. That's my view. I agree with Descartes about that, even if the truth isn't very nice. So, second thing, terrible things can be extremely interesting. So a clinical, and the interest of something terrible could just be wholly in its terribleness. A clinically depressed person's narrative obsession with the course of his life might be intricate and florid in its narrative detail, and in that sense, amazingly interesting, but not therefore good. So interest is not good, always good. And here I like to quote Henry James, or rather one of his characters, who says, the trouble, the clinically depressed person is too self-concerned, and narrativity is always a kind of self-concern. And Henry James says, true happiness consists in getting out of oneself, but the point is not only to get out, you must stay out. And to stay out, you must have some absorbing errand. Well, that sounds like Susan Wolf, actually, but okay. Well, I've been talking about interest, being interesting, and of course we think of that as a more or less objective property. Being interested is obviously different, it's explicitly subjective. And these two things can obviously come apart. This is a familiar point. So when Sisyphus is neurologically adjusted in such a way that he finds his life incredibly interesting, we think he's just wrong. I don't know whether you think that would be a nice thing to do for him, but we think he's really interested, but it's just not actually interesting. Even so, it seems that interest isn't really an objective property. So when you're really fascinated by things that I find boring, and vice versa, neither of us need be wrong. Here I like to, if I had more time, I'd bring in a lovely paper by William James called On a Certain Blindness in Human Beings, where we just cannot see the passion. We cannot understand the passion that other human beings might feel for something. He quotes Robert Louis Stevenson at great length in that paper. Okay, but is interest really not objective? Well, I hesitate on that. I don't know much about aesthetics, but I certainly find that some Terran works of art seem objectively full of interest. But of course, the good old Martians might sincerely disagree. So I'm going to assume that interest is ultimately subjective. It doesn't really matter because I don't think we can connect narrativity tightly to meaning/interest, whether we take interest to be objective or subjective. And that's my first main conclusion. My second main conclusion is something I've already suggested, that interest is no more likely to be good than bad. A life that lacked it could be a great deal better, well, not lacked it completely, but didn't have, wasn't truly rich and interesting. A life that lacked it to that extent could be a great deal better than one that had it. There's a lot of people probably know the Chinese saying, "May you live in interesting times," and this is meant to be a curse. Apparently, you do not want to live in interesting times, because that probably means war and murder and famine and disease. Apparently, that it doesn't actually have that origin in the Chinese literature, but it's good enough for me that many people could have thought that could be a curse rather than a blessing. So a simple example: if Job in the Old Testament, if his ingeniously varied tortures had continued indefinitely, his life would have continued to be very interesting indeed, full of meaning, but also hellish. And as Hitler always has to turn up, his life is extremely interesting. It's kind of almost shocking when I say that. Full of meaning. Okay, well, so that's the neutral notion of meaning. Let's now see what we can say about, this is near the end now. What about meaning G, good meaning? But we can focus on that. I'm just going to have to call it meaning G, because what's the relation between narrativity and meaning G? Yeah, well, I've already given the answer in a way, but I'll go through it. So what about the claim, number 7, by the narrativists? They say meaning G requires narrativity. They think it's necessary for good meaning, as it were. Although it's not the case that narrativity entails meaning G. No one thinks it's sufficient. I don't think. I hope not, because I have my clinically depressed person with their narrative, and it's messing them up. So we can sort of get a general question: what's the general form of a human life that's high in good meaning? And Susan Wolf has given a very influential answer. She says that meaning, and she uses the word in a positively normative way. She just assumes that it has a positive force. She says meaning arises when subjective attraction meets objective attractiveness, and one is able to do something about it or with it. Subjective interest must couple with an objectively worthwhile pursuit. Then you get good meaning. Well, as I said earlier, I think that is a good proposal on the whole, but I don't think it's the whole story. One doesn't always need to do something to have meaning G. A project or a pursuit is not necessary. Suppose, I'll say a bit more about that. Suppose we accept Wolf, then we get another question. What is the range of worthwhile pursuits? And in answering, I'd say we really better not have a hard ranking, a kind of lexical ordering, as some people call it. We shouldn't, and I think we shouldn't rule out intensely hedonistic lives, because for any human activity, there's some people who have an extraordinary gift for it. Some are brilliant at pleasure. And their hedonism may overflow with interest, good meaning, and not at anyone's expense. Someone might object, oh, but those people are just lotus eaters. This is a reference to the story of Ulysses, or they just lie around eating lotus, I suppose, and doing nothing. They're all stoned. I think Ulysses and his men are all on this island, I would say, no, there's more to pleasure than lotus eating. And one, I don't know how many of you know about Tom Bombadil in The Lord of the Rings. Anyone? Well, he's an extraordinary character, the most extraordinary character in a way in the whole of The Lord of the Rings, but he's just sort of in the joy of nature and not pursuing any project or purpose. And his life is very high in good meaning. And then sex is very important in human life. And it seems to me that a person may live a life of extraordinary sexual intensity with all the, I quote Tom Nagel, the multi-level interpersonal awareness that it essentially involves. And that would be good meaning. I don't know whether, I think it would be reductive to say that there's a point or purpose in there. I mean, I would hope that it would have was its own fulfillment. So now I'm going to quote a bit of Shakespeare, just for fun. So famously, Antony's second in command, Enobarbus, says about Cleopatra, age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. So Enobarbus takes Cleopatra's interestingness to be grounded in her defects. You may not fully get this, but I'll read it. Other women cloy the appetites they feed, but she makes hungry where most she satisfies, for vilest things become themselves in her, that the holy priest bless her when she is riggish. And you've got a definition of riggish on your handout there. Well, just a thought about that. You know, variety isn't necessary when it comes to not going stale. Unvarying custom has its own astonishing intensities, as much in sex as in other things. The highest reaches of sexual love aren't in tension with fidelity. In fact, I think they're unattainable without it. And it isn't in any sense a matter of constraint, not unless squares having four sides is a matter of constraint. So now I get an objection. This addressed to me, you, they say, are trying to cast doubt on the idea that good meaning requires narrativity. But you're not thinking things through. It's addressed to me. Take your own case of sexual love, which is designed to be outside the normal range of cases. That actually, they say to me, essentially involves narrativity, an explicit sense of a shared past. Narrative outlook is actually an essential prerequisite of the most intense forms of interpersonal intentionality, the core of sexual love. Well, my replies to this is, well, I can well imagine that this seems true to naturally narrative people, but non-narratives know that it's false. Perhaps it is true for narratives, good for them, so long as they say, as long as they, there's a don't, as long as they don't say, there's a don't missing, that narrative sexual love is essentially higher or deeper than non-narrative. I am going to justify this. It's not just I say yes and you say no. The point is that the debate here is kind of fruitless because there are areas in life in which we human beings perfectly misunderstand one another. In the present case, the mistake on the part of the narrative people is about the way that the past works or functions in love and friendship. It's good in love and friendship, its good effects can be invisible and involve no explicit memory. My favorite image for this is that the past can function like the intense training or rehearsals of musicians or athletes. All that past work, intensity, is vividly alive in their present performance, even when they have no memory of specific past practice sessions. So the past can inform the present profoundly without one being someone who thinks of the past at all or being narrative. So here's my claim. The past can be very important in love and friendship in the complete absence of narrativity. And second, the past, in any case, needn't be of any importance. So why was Michel de Montaigne's friendship with Etienne de la Boétie perfect? That's a famous sort of image of a perfect friendship. There are plenty of others. But, well, answer, because it was him, because it was me. That's Montaigne's words. The point being that there are these immediate and unchosen affinities between human beings. Profound friendship doesn't require any ability to recall past intense shared or experiences. It's shown in how one is in the present. Montaigne says, I am better at friendship than at anything else, although, quote, there is nobody less suited than I am to start talking about memory. I can find hardly a trace of it in myself. I doubt if there is any other memory in the world as grotesquely faulty as mine is. And I think that the same goes for sexual love. The narratives are wrong about love and friendship. It's not a universal condition. And even if they'd been right about that, their point wouldn't have touched the lover of the natural world or really of anything, a lover of beetles, or like Darwin was a great lover of beetles. So next thought, even if one feels a connection with one's personal past, it needn't be distinctively narrative. It certainly needn't involve any sense of one's personality, either explicit or implicit, as persisting and developing over time. I'm going to skip that quotation, which is kind of interesting. Objection back to me. No, you focused on the example of love and friendship. Well, they're very interesting subjects, but you're missing the central point. Narrative experience has great and special good meaning, good interest in and of itself. My reply. Well, this may be so for some, sure. Narrativity can obviously take its place alongside many other possible sources of good meaning. Objection comes back. No, you're not getting it, they say to me. It's not just that narrative experience is a source of good meaning in an unmatchable way. No, it constitutes good meaning in a foundational manner. This is what the narrativists are going to have to say if they, I reply, well, guess what? I disagree. That was Ricoeur. Oh, sorry, I missed out Ricoeur. Here's Ricoeur. Life, he says, is I quote, an activity and a passion in search of a narrative. Meaning, on this view, good meaning must involve narrative. Well, I disagree. I think Ricoeur's claim is simply false. Not only that, I think it's an extraordinarily bad idea, considered as a general recommendation about how to live. Again, as always, eclectic, good for some, possibly, but very bad for others. Some think that narrative is a necessary part of a good religious life. And I'm pretty sure that Alistair McIntyre and Charles Taylor are motivated by this. But I think actually this is another great mistake. It's a product of a severely constricted vision. And it's connected as often as not to a fantasy of quest. And here I have a worry. This is, again, not true of everyone, but almost everything that passes for religious belief in most human beings is really about themselves. So that would suggest that the narrative attitude, thinking it essential to the religious life, is a mistake. William James says in his book, The Variety of Religious Experience, religion, in fact, for the great majority of our own race, means immortality and nothing else. And here I have a rude remark about Kierkegaard, which I'd have to justify. I mean, Kierkegaard is fascinating in many ways, but I think he just couldn't, he got it more wrong than anyone I know, in my view, about how to lead the religious life. So, skip that. We're nearly there. Again, coming back on David Shoemaker. Well, I'm going to quote him. He's reporting the review he rejects. he imagines someone saying, can't you see that experiences must be actively unified? They must be gathered together into the life of one narrative ego by virtue of a story the subject tells that weaves them together, giving them a kind of coherence and intelligibility they wouldn't otherwise have had. For this is how the various experiences and events of your life come to have any real meaning at all. And again, I just don't get it. And Iris Murdoch, I appeal to Iris Murdoch. She says the search for unity is deeply natural. I mean, unity, an individual looking for unity in their own life, though again, I have no idea what that might be. But like so many things which are deeply natural, it may be capable of producing nothing but a variety of illusions. Well, okay, let's see what, let's imagine a case in which someone does find coherence, intelligibility in their life, and they get it right. They're not self-deceived. And the experience of this is wonderful for them. Well, their life clearly has good meaning in it, and it's coming from this. But is this unmatchable? A long quotation from Plutarch, who puts this line. I'll read a little. He says, "The foolish overlook and neglect good things even when they're present, because their thoughts are always intent upon the future. But the wise, by remembrance, make even those benefits that are no longer at hand vividly existent for themselves." And so on. So he's saying this is a great source of human good and pleasure and interest, memory. And my response to that is, well, yes, this can obviously be good. But it's just one good among other. It's not necessary for good meaning, and it's not an unmatchably good kind of good meaning. And it's not the case for people like Montaigne. I've got a few other people here: Marcus Aurelius, Earl of Shaftesbury, Walter Pater, and Nasruddin again. Okay, well, that's the end. So I gave, at the very beginning, when I gave to the question, what is the meaning of life? I gave the answer, none. But actually then, while I was writing this, someone told me that an Italian comedian had given an answer, which I thought was a really good answer. It's as it were, grammatically positive. The meaning of life is life. The Italian is Roman dialect there. And the end of life, he means death is the end. That seems to be perfect, because it explains the value of life being just life and not needing any sort of external boost. And so then just 2 days ago, I discovered that this was not original, and that Goethe, well, Goethe's slightly different because he's talking about the purpose, but there it is, from Goethe, the purpose of life is life itself. And that's it. I've just, if you've got the PDF and you wanted to follow up any of the references, I could send out the references. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So before we go on to the discussion and questions, would you like to take a few minutes?
I'm fine.
Okay. All right then.
Maybe everyone else does. Well, anyone who wants can disappear.
Yeah, that's up to them. That they have that luxury.
Yeah.
So yes, we can continue on with the discussion then.
Hello, Kathy. I can see Kathy Berendt. Haven't seen you for a long time.
I want to say hello, Professor Parik. I
Yes.
haven't seen. Great to see you.
Same here, yes.
I don't know whether any of you have thought about this kind of topic.
Well, as we wait, perhaps I can kind of get things started. Well, personally, when I you don't mention the episodic and the diachronic self in the talk, but of course that's also present in the background, I guess.
Yes.
When I first read, I remember that moment very clearly. When I first read Against Narrativity, I said, finally, because the idea of this connection between narrativity and this normative aspect of it is so endorsed. And the idea that, people might have certain self-consciousness in an episodic sense. I was wondering, actually, you argue against the idea that one should live in a narrative manner to have meaning. I was wondering if you ever actually went ahead and argued that perhaps one should experience life as an episodic self to have meaning, like change things around and actually.
Good. Yes. Perhaps I should. Yes. So I've got this distinction between narrative types and, on the one hand, and non-narrative or indeed anti-narrative types on the other hand. But there is this related distinction which Sinan mentioned between the episodic and the diachronic. Those are not ideal terms, I have to say, but that is a purely empirical psychological distinction, which I'll say what it is. To be episodic is, the best is just, suppose you think of a time, usually my audience are like 18-year-olds in an undergraduate class. It's quite difficult to do this, but most of you are older, so it's much better. I can say, think back sort of 5 or 10 years, or be 15 years, or whatever you like. Do you naturally think of yourself, obviously the same human being, as you, in italics? Do you naturally think of that person as you? And if you do, I call you diachronic, that you naturally think that's me. And if you don't, then you're episodic. And of course, it has degrees. So somebody might actually still feel that's pretty much me a week ago or a year ago, but not 5 years ago, and so on. So it's not a sharp distinction. So I'm very episodic in that sense. If I think about my childhood, or I think that poor little boy, or something like that. But so Sinem is recommending that I've always thought of these things as given traits. These are partly, genetically determined, partly early experience determined psychological traits, but actually that's not right either, because they can be considerably affected by depression, by illness, by all sorts of things. So you don't have to say I'm either one or the other. You may move between them, but yes, so this is a good idea, I think. Perhaps one would have to sort of block one's natural storying and try to live more you could say in the moment. And that's interesting too, because of course there's a well-known recommendation by Jesus in the New Testament where he says, consider the wildflowers. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. That is, live in the moment as a kind of. So that's a well-known ethical ideal, even spiritual ideal. So yes, perhaps that's something that could be practiced by people. They should try and get out of this endless thinking of their lives too much in terms of where am I coming from and where am I going. Yes, I don't think I may have, I don't know, perhaps I should add that somewhere next time. I'll do it. Thank you, Sinem. Yes. I think Kathy was going to ask a question.
Yes. Hello, Galen.
Hello.
It's not a well-formed question because I haven't thought about this in a while, and I think you may have answered it in the past, but I'm wondering if you could speak to the connection between narrative and memory, because you often slide from talk of one to the other, and the importance of memory for narrativity in the absence of memory signaling the non-narrative person. But of course, there are narrativists who've suggested, although it doesn't necessarily help their case, that our narratives can be largely subterranean and subconscious, in which case things like the musician analogy doesn't stand as a clear-cut example of a non-narrative life.
Oh, okay. Is that the end of the question? Or
I believe it is, yes. We'll stop there.
Yeah, so first of all, there's no, I think that someone could be very episodic and non-narrative and have a terrific memory. So again, there's dissociation there. I don't know. I mean, to me, the move of saying it could be unconscious seems to me to lose. I mean, it loses its distinctive claim. If somebody does make that move, then I may have to say, oh, well, okay, if that's what you want to call being narrative, then these people are narrative. I do think that it's implausible. So, you know, the string quartet or whatever, or the rock group playing in the way they've practiced for so long, that is, I mean, that would be like saying that any skill acquired is narrative. Like, I must be narrative because I can now ride a bicycle or something. That can't be right. So I would resist. I would understand that they might want to say, no, it's mostly unconscious, because that would be a way of saving their thesis. But I would think you've lost. So I'd be accept it with that qualification, that I don't think that's really what was central. But can you, perhaps you'd like to, I think you want to say something, so Kathy.
Well, I mean, you could put the sort of constraint Shackman does on it, that you have to, if called upon, be able to articulate it, and maybe that's the test.
Well, then that I would think lots of people would fail spectacularly, and sort of almost extraordinarily speechless about themselves. I've got a nice quotation from Freddie Eyre. You know, just has no. People have no idea about themselves, and oh yeah, I better add something here, because you might say next, or someone pursuing your line might say next, well, what about Socrates? The unexamined life is not worth living, and I would want to say that that has been. The literal Greek is the unexamined life is not a life for a human being. And it turns out that that has nothing specially to do with self-examination. It just means you should think about human life and what it is to be a human being. That is, not, as it were, generically, not sort of go in for self-analysis. And I would say, yes, you do need some of that. So I would say Socrates might be right. It still doesn't imply anything like narrativity.
Thank you.
Okay, I didn't see the hands before. Perhaps they were raised, but now I can see them. So I apologize if you were raising them and I didn't see them before. So I'll just kind of go ahead. Richard.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I found it very interesting.
A bit of meaning.
Yeah, yes, yeah. It has meaning for me because I'm doing a bit of my thesis, PhD thesis on it at the moment, actually. But I'm a psychologist by background. So I was wondering about the list of platitudes about narrativity that you had on the handout.
Right.
And you went through those, and you said, but narrativity should be something more. And I'm particularly interested in the psychology. So you had, I think number 6, words about psychology. And it seemed to me that that I think that what you put down can be counted as facts of psychology, but I don't see why we should regard them as platitudes. So I'm wondering really whether we're sort of slipping between seeing narrativity as a psychological thesis and then seeing it in a much stronger sense as a metaphysical thesis. As a metaphysical thesis with some kind of normative implications, whereas if we see it as a psychological thesis, that people to a greater or lesser extent just create narratives, or maybe they don't do it very much, or maybe others do it a lot. First of all, it seems to me we don't seem to need any kind of ethical narrativity thesis anyway, if we see it as a psychological thesis. And I don't see why it's a platitude. And I think yeah, and in one of your papers, I think your 2004 paper, you say that it can be trivial, but I don't see why it is trivial.
Oh, well, okay, there may be a slight misunderstanding here because as I somewhere say, if it's trivial, it's true. And that is so good in philosophy. So platitude also, if something is a platitude, it's true. And that's of extreme, that's never for me, it's never for me a criticism of anything. Right. So maybe that was slightly misleading because, yes, I mean, it's true that both those words are sometimes used with a pejorative tone. And I really didn't mean that. I just meant, perhaps I should rethink that. I just meant these are very basic truths. And so the claim was only that if that's all that people meant, or if any subset of those was all that people meant by being narrative, then I would concede the thesis that I'd even concede that everybody is narrative. Well, not everybody, but nearly everybody. But I still wouldn't think that that was what they had in mind from the normative or ethical point of view.
Well, it seems to me that if one is criticizing the kind of thesis that someone like Maria Scheckman puts forward, then clearly she seems to be saying something rather more stronger than that. Yeah. So I suppose in that sense you might call it trivial, but if one puts aside Scheckman's thesis, then it seems to me that it can be both true and also useful in a psychological sense to understand about people, about how they create narratives, and therefore it seems to be a kind of useful thesis.
Oh, but wait, it depends which thesis exactly, because yes, if I come across someone who is naturally, as it were, a narrative type, as it were, storying their own lives to themselves, so that will be of extreme intrinsic interest as a psychological type. I agree with that.
So then it would become an empirical question about the extent to which people do that, or
yes, absolutely. Yeah, and that's where I resist social psychologists like Dan McAdams, who just say it's a universal. Actually, there's something worth saying here, which is if you ever look back at those quotations, you'll see quite a lot of them about identity, people's identity. And it was not till long after I wrote the first paper that I discovered that psychologists and philosophers use that word in a completely different way. So a philosopher talking about a person's identity will usually mean, as it were, something like their true self or who they really are. But it seems to be, in psychology, it seems to mean a person's self-image, self-conception.
Well, I think I am,
Yes. And I mean, I realized that some of my objections to psychologists, as it were, collapsed at that point because when you're creating your identity, to me, that meant you're sort of a metaphysical, that is how you come to have such a thing, a true characteral being. But no, sometimes they just meant how your view of yourself, your self-conception.
Yeah. Right. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. We can move on to Daniel.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Professor Strawson, for a very meaningful talk this afternoon. I had a few points I wanted to ask for clarification on, and then maybe ask a follow-up if that's okay. Firstly, with the quotes at the end regarding the meaning of life being life itself, were you endorsing these quotes?
Yes.
Okay, and so there is a meaning to life, and that
well, if you're going to use the word, the meaning of life construction at all, then that's the best one.
Would that work with the meaning in life construction?
Yes, I think pretty. No, but I mean, not you could, but not as I've done it, because I've suggested that it's interestingness.
Yeah, which was actually the next thing I wanted to ask you about. I mean, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on the relationship between meaning and interestingness. Are these literally to be taken as equivalent terms here?
Well, I think it's not far off, right, what might be meant by meaning in life, but it really is, what I say is I'm going to take this definition as correct and see what happens. Of course, in the literature, most people think something much more like Susan Wolf. They think that it's sort of valuable projects and pursuits is what gives meaning. And I just don't, I really want to resist that, because there are people who are just gifted for, as it were, for just being there, as it were. Maybe it's Dasein without any of the horrid anxiety about death or something. I mean, they're just good at being in the moment, and they might have a very boring job which is of no importance to them. So I think their life could be full of meaning / interest, because they're highly receptive. And so was that clear enough? I mean, it wasn't that I think it's not usually used, that equation is not usually accepted when people talk about meaning in life. I proposed it and said, well, I think it's pretty good, really. But and part of my point, I mean, it's not, slightly, perhaps I want to be slightly annoying, but is to say, you're going to have to say that Hitler's life is full of meaning.
I mean, actually, the third point was really to try and push on this a little bit, and maybe kind of motivated from the sorts of thoughts you might have reading someone like Susan Wolf. It sounds like you're not going to then draw a distinction between the phenomenological experience of something being meaningful or interesting and it being objectively so.
Well, I don't know what she says about that. I think that, do you know her stuff well?
No, not well at all. I mean, I read it a long time ago. I remember the kind of the pithy remark, the 2-sentence, subjective attraction meeting objective meaningfulness. Perhaps if I talk a bit more about what's really motivating. Sorry, go on.
No, let me just, so you've suggested a possible case where we might think that their achievements were magnificent. They pursued their career and it was objectively interesting, but maybe they were just very unemotional and didn't really get much out of it. I mean, it's not plausible, but I suppose we could imagine a fictitious case of someone writing magnificent music, but they just kind of do it kind of mechanically and without enjoying it. That would separate. So there's no phenomenology there, but there is what we would think of as creation of enormous objective value and meaning. I think she has to be concerned with the phenomenology, that is, it being experienced as good. But then she couples this objective requirement on top of that it must be also something objectively worthwhile.
Yeah, I actually wanted to suggest to you the inverse case, if I can just go on for a bit longer now, I'll shut up and let other people talk. But I know Susan Wolf has this example of someone who likes to count the numbers of blades of grass in the garden, and they find this immensely meaningful, we might say. It's something that they find very, very pleasurable. And it looks like we don't want to say that this person's living a meaningful life if they do this. So I wanted to put that to you. And then also a second case, if I may, and I really will shut up. What about the person whose the amount of interest perhaps that we feel towards any specific action or actions in our life might be different to the amount of meaning that we get from or feel that we get from certain actions. In this case, it looks like meaning and interest might begin to move slightly separately from each other.
Can you give an example?
If I have a couple of minutes, perhaps.
Okay.
Well, maybe if you think that the person who counts the blades of grass finds that to be the most interesting thing in their life, and they're much less interested, to be truthful, in their children. But the whole institution of being a parent is immensely more meaningful to them, even if it's less interesting.
Gosh, yes. Well, yeah. I mean, the case of the blade of grass case is, a familiar idea, and I mean, it's a bit like my Sisyphus when he's been neurologically adjusted so that he enjoys what he has to do. It's a very forceful, but fairly obvious point, I think, that Susan Wolf makes, that we think something's wrong here. I think I'd want to say I don't want to rule out completely. I'm counting blades of grass is pretty much pushing it, but if somebody just sort of sat there day after day and enjoyed the scene, I'm not sure that I would think that was worthless. Okay, as for your, I mean, you can push the words around as much as you like. What is this person who doesn't pay much attention to their children but thinks it's extremely meaningful and is really gripped up by counting blades? What are they going to say when you talk to them? Are they going to say that it's a difficult case, but I'm sure you could find nice context in which you could get the word interest and the word meaning to move apart. Yes, I do think that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. We have Danny.
Yes, thank you. So this might just be a version of Daniel's question again, so there may not be anything new to talk about here. But so for somebody who wants to say that like meaning is something good, something to be striven for, something to promote in our lives, something we should promote in other people's lives, do you have something to say to them about like why they should abandon this thought? Like, sort of average people, when they worry about the meaning of life, it seems to be, something you should want, and it would be good if you get it. And, being Hitler would not get you meaning. So, I mean, is there anything more to say about why we should reject this kind of Socratic goodness sort of meaning?
No, I mean, it's the standard use of the term in this debate is to think that meaning is, as it were, positively valenced. That, but so I just thought I'd subtract that and see what you get. But I mean, I know, but I mean, Hitler, he might have said, I failed, but I failed magnificently or something. I mean, I don't think we can get meaning to stick with the good. Yeah. Do you want to?
Thanks. No, that's good enough for me. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Danny. Yes, Karim Hoca.
Yes. Okay, thank you. It's a really quick question. I guess it's a follow-up on Kathy's first question. So why not think of narrativity along the same lines of thinking, to take your example of the athlete, right? So he's been training or she's been training, many training sessions over years. All these sessions and that training is deeply present, right? Mm-hmm. However, there is no memory of it, mm-hmm. But it is very much, not only present in many ways, maybe they constitute the athlete in the competition or in the Olympics. Why not narrativity functions? We can think of it as functioning in the same way. Yes, it would be maybe unconscious or subconscious, but we might be able maybe to access it. So to give maybe a slight benefit of thinking about it this way, it might turn out that I am a racist, right? I mean, if I never at one point thought of myself as a racist, but if you pick up different moments in my behavior over the past years, or a misogynist or whatever, right? I think none of them, at no point I was acting, but when someone brings it to me and I look at these actions, I might realize actually maybe, you know, you can learn something about ourselves with this by looking at our current self as maybe being constituted by these previous moments, just like the athlete's performance is constituted by their training.
Okay, no, sure. So let's just to get clear. Obviously, early events in one's past life have an effect on how one is, maybe a deep effect, and certainly thinking about them can be valuable. But we have to get a bit more specific than that if this is going to be unconscious narrativity in particular. I mean, I think as for the access idea that Kathy mentioned, I think that could just be plus or minus. Someone might say it's a condition on it that they should in principle be able to access it. You could also allow a case perhaps where they can't even do that. But nevertheless, the unconscious stuff that's working to make them who they are now has a distinctively narrative character that it involves. Oh, does it have to involve them consciously thinking about themselves in the past, but having forgotten doing so? Or is the whole thing going to be possibly unconscious? I'm not sure. Do you want to speak?
Yes, just very, I mean, the narrativist, I mean, I'm just trying to take that role now. I mean, the narratives might simply insist that there is a narrative. It just, I mean, you can get it wrong. You can maybe every time you try to figure it out, you discover a different aspect of it. I mean, it's an ongoing thing. I mean, it doesn't mean that, yeah. I just think that the narrativist can always push back on this and say, okay, there is a narrative and...
Well, okay, I'm sure, but I really do think it becomes important to stress not to forget the meaning of the word narrative. So suppose, I mean, everybody maybe has some kind of self-concept, and I might indeed have thought about things that I did in the past and thought that was bad, but that still isn't narrative. That is just... What is narrative has to involve, at the minimum, some sort of way of thinking about yourself as something over time, or so a mere. Suppose I did something, and the next day I thought that was really bad, and I felt ashamed or something, and suppose that influences me now. That for me is not narrative. So you see, that's one of the worries I have, is that the narrativists think they can scoop up all this stuff, which is not strictly speaking narrative. Now you might say it's automatically narrative just because it's a thought I had about myself in the past that is affecting how I am now. But then I think it's lost. So you might think you might say on their behalf, well, they never meant to be that specific. And what might happen as we went on talking is that I suppose we would probably get closer together. We'd find some ground where we could agree that was more in the middle, but I don't see it yet.
Thank you.
Okay. Don't right now. Okay.
Oh,
I'll just make a little a quick comment, maybe, or maybe question, and then I'll again, Daniel and Danny. to me, like narrativity, the narrative approach, it never occurred to me that it's could be an unconscious nature to it, because what makes a narrative approach in the discussion of all this personal identity seems to be fundamentally that it's purpose driven. Perhaps the subject is not perfectly aware of what the purpose might be, but this construction of a story out of whatever is in the past is very different from, as you said, remembering something and thinking about it, making a judgment, or even being aware of why you are the way you are now because of your past. Even that awareness does not have to involve narrativity, correct?
Well, I think, yeah, I agree. Yes, I think the minimum, there must be a minimum on it, which is you must be thinking of yourself developmentally in some way. And just to think, to sort of get real about something you did and see that it was wrong or perhaps even right is not intrinsically developmental, even if it has an effect on you later. Well, yeah.
So perhaps, I mean, the purpose-drivenness, maybe if that could be thought of as an essential property of the narrative approach, it might be interesting to articulate what the purpose there might be. But I mean, I have not anything further to say on that.
Yeah, well, I think that Charles Taylor and Alistair McIntyre are interesting here, because I think there is a religious background to the way they think about it. And I admit it's extremely natural. Life is a quest of some sort. And I think Alistair McIntyre, for example, thought it was a quest to become good. And that's, I would be the last person to say that was, well, I would certainly understand somebody who felt that. I think this is what I used to think myself when I was a hippie or a flower. Well, that's what you had to do. But I just think that it's I just think that it's not actually the right way to think. It's too much about yourself. You need to turn out more. And so I think that it's pragmatically not going to work. But I mean, many people who pursue some sort of spiritual path are going to be thinking in those terms.
Okay, I'll again, please, Daniel.
Yeah, I wanted to interrogate you a little more regarding this relationship that you suggest between meaning and interest, and really get your thoughts. So I thought of an example of when I would be tempted to say that you could have a life where there is interest without any meaning, which I think you'd want to suggest wouldn't be possible. So what about if you think about a tragic case of someone whose life is falling apart, everything's imploding, maybe their marriage recently ended, they've got difficult relationships with the other loved people in their life, and maybe they've taken to drink, and really they would say that their life has absolutely no meaning.
No, they would, yeah, they might well say that, because they might well be using the word in the way most people use it when they talk about this. But my point was precisely, I would say, no, their life is full of meaning, and that's the trouble. So, I don't, yeah, it's just, you're absolutely right. That's how people would naturally talk.
Okay.
But
so why should we?
I think it. No, I find it useful to press this and to say this is sloppy. And I would say about the way we've always talked about the meaning of life is in a way sloppy. And although it's natural, I'm not going to complain about the fact that we do so. It's perfectly intelligible to me. But I want to push it and say, no, your life is horribly full of meaning. The word, as it were, the positive valence is not built into the word. That's all. So it's really terminological.
Okay. What is there to advocate your use of the word meaning in this way, opposed to a more everyday sense, would you say?
Well, it's not more every day. Every day for me is, I mean, all talk about meaning of life is already sort of a bit self-helpy or Facebooky or something. So meaning in the everyday self is a property of words, isn't it? I mean, that's the core base meaning of meaning, and everything else is metaphorical extension.
Okay, yeah.
And you're absolutely right. There's always meant to be something good, and I say, well, why should we accept that?
Yeah, I suppose my intuition here would be that there's some sort of phenomena, some sort of phenomenological phenomena that we're trying to grasp towards and speaking about meaning very imperfectly, which, yeah, there might be a different way of speaking about it. But I suppose if you don't accept that there is something kind of underlying this very this very imprecise way of gesturing towards something that may or may not exist, then
Yeah, there is something underlying it. There's an idea of what gives life value. I mean, what about just, and that's usually built into the metaphorical use of meaning in this particular context is, so I mean, it just seemed a good idea to me to question that standard assumption.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I do think, I mean, as I say, it's like I slightly cringe even as I say it, but and Hitler's such a boring example, but this is a life full of meaning and horrible. Yeah, okay.
On a related note, before I pass the word on to Danny, it just occurred to me that the conception of meaning that you mentioned here seems to be very close to the conception of intrinsic value of consciousness literature, where it's not because of the things that you are able to do because of being conscious, but the intrinsic value of consciousness, just there being something it is like to be.
Yes.
That seems to be parallel, I think, to me, perhaps the conception of meaning here.
No, that's helpful because, I mean, some of you may know that I'm quite fond of the panpsychist theory, but so it's not a crazy view. I do think that all interesting consciousness, I think, is a product of evolution. But you could say that is actually where meaning or interest entered the universe. It entered it when there got to be creatures like ourselves that have this highly developed consciousness. Yeah, so that and that gives you, I believe, I don't know, Sinem, do you agree? I'm thinking of that as a neutral. It's ethically neutral. Meaning begins with consciousness. That is, or mattering. Let's take, mattering is a something matters. Not matter in the sense of physical stuff, but mattering only comes into existence with consciousness. That's clear. If there's no consciousness, nothing matters, because mattering requires someone or something to whom it matters. So yeah, mattering. What about that? Mattering is neutral, so it can matter. Pain matters because it's terrible. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Danny, please.
Yeah, thank you. So again, this follows from your answer to Daniel's question. So he suggested, look, there's maybe something that people like Wolf are trying to get at when they say, there's objective value tied to meaning, or there's something good tied to meaning. And you said, let's see what happens when we reject this. Let's see how far we can get, what we can do. And so, I mean, now I'm tempted to say, look, there's something Wolf is getting at, and she wants to use the word meaning for this. And there's like some good stuff there, some objectively good stuff there. There's something you want to get at with the term meaning, where we give up this link to the good. And there's also something there. And, meaning is a pretty big word. It's pretty vague. We've already made it very, very vague because we've already sort of moved past what we thought was the question, like what's the point or purpose? We said, oh, there is no purpose. So let's stop using meaning for that. Let's talk about meaning in life in some other sense. But like, yeah, now we're just, we're in very confusing territory. The word meaning is like just slippery here. Really, like what we should do is say, is there any meaning to life? no, like that's the correct answer. And just stop using the word meaning for any of this other stuff we're talking about, which is all very interesting, but there's sort of no disagreement here between you and Wolf, except over the word.
Oh, was that a question? I wasn't sure what the question was there.
Yeah, and the question is like, why is this not the case? Why is this not sort of just fighting over the word? Like, it's not even fighting. It's just, you're both using the word meaning to describe something, and that's fine.
Yeah, look, obviously there is such a thing as a good life and such a thing as a bad life. And some people will say for there to be a, yeah, well, I agree that for there to be a good life, there has to be the thing that people call meaning in the positively valent sense. Yeah, I don't know, I don't think we're just fighting over words. We're kind of, this is one variety of conceptual exploration or elucidation, the kind of things we do. And there are also, a lot of theses, specific theses I want to resist, that the idea that meaning in life has to involve objectively worthwhile. Well, what is an objectively worthwhile pursuit? Someone who's a sort of natural hedonist and just loves nature but does nothing. Is Susan Wolf going to have to mark that down as not really making the grade? I don't know.
I mean, just on the kind of the person who enjoys the good life, I don't know, living in nature and enjoying all this natural stuff. I mean, it seems like that's only not going to count as meaningful for Wolf if we already have some account of what objective values are. And if within these values, there's a place for living this kind of romantic life in nature, then that could be a meaningful life. And if there's not, then they're kind of mistaken about what it is they should be pursuing in life. And for this reason, it's not meaningful.
Yeah. I sometimes think that for human beings to be happy at all, their happiness becomes part of the history of the universe, and that's a contribution, and it doesn't matter. Well, okay, Kathy, I see you're.
Yes, I'll take the opportunity to ask one more question. So I'm going to give you a list of things here that I think the running themes that have come up here again, okay, that you've also brought up in the past, and ask about their relation to both meaning and narrative. So here are what seem to me some of your perennial targets, which is, well, here, the sort of mistaken endowing of something with a positive valence when in fact it's just neutral. Mm-hmm. Okay, concerns about egotism and self-absorption. Yes. Our potential for self-delusion. Yes. Taking certain terms that are protean and trying to treat them as specific and falling into problems of equivocation. Our activity that detracts from our ability to focus in the present, and an overinflated sense of purposefulness. So it seems to me that both meaning and narrative are being accused of falling into these traps, at least when understood a certain way. Would it be fair or charitable to say that these are your real concerns and you're only targeting talk about narrative or meaning insofar as it brings out the worst in us?
I wouldn't have said put meaning just on a par with narrative there, because I accept that there can be good meaning, as it were. So it's certainly true that there's a persistent polemical element here, and people who seem against some, as you know, there are some very outspoken defenders of narrative who just think it's the be all and end all of everything. I see it's getting kind of dark here. I admit to all these themes. Yes, and I'm just defending, saying there are other ways of being, and they are not of less value. I should say that over the years I've had communications from people who've been very grateful to see this point of view put. So at least it was good that someone should have put the other point, because they felt that they were failing as human beings because they couldn't find this narrative impulse in themselves.
could you select one of those things as being maybe more concern to you than others?
Well, I think I'm very keen on. I agree with Iris Murdoch, that when people start to do this, they fall into fantasy to a huge extent. And there's a nice bit in one of Descartes', I think he's Descartes writing to Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who basically outsmarts him in their correspondence. And they actually raise the question, is it better to be happy but deluded, or know the truth and be unhappy? And Descartes says, maybe there are limits to this. He says, no, I'd rather face the truth, even if it means being unhappy. And I can't help agreeing with him about that. That said, it's not even as if the people who fall into fantasy about themselves are going to be more happy. I mean, it's maybe some are, but it could just as well be a source of yet more unhappiness. But, you know, someone like Dennett thinks that we all, as it were, write ourselves up. I see, it's getting a bit dark. You can still see me there, right? And we all sort of have a falsely positive picture of ourselves. That's just not true. That's just empirically false. There's a nice, actually, paper by a psychologist about people who, as it were, put themselves down and have. But many people do, and maybe they do feel better for doing that. And, well, some people think that that's okay if they live a happier life as a result. But if you sort of have a hankering for truth at at any cost, doesn't look, I'm going on too long really here, but do you know the case of Susan Bryson? Quite a lot of philosophers know about Susan Bryson, who was brutally assaulted and raped and left for dead in France. And she's written a book about it, and there was a long process of recovery. And I believe that somewhere in that book, there's a suggestion that someone says something that psychotherapists say, like, well, you need to create a narrative here. And it's not clear to her, in fact, even to me, that the truth is to be held on to at all costs because it was too horrible. So, yeah, there are possible cases that are counterexamples to the general trend of my thinking. There may be a case where it's just best to have a bit of self-deception, or yeah, definitely. Okay. Have we got, I guess, not everyone who I can see or see their names is in Istanbul, right? I mean, Rohit presumably is in New York City.
No, I saw sunlight. I mean, in some of the, so I'm guessing they're not, because it's dark here.
Yes, right. Anyway, such is our current state of communication. Good.
Okay, I'll go ahead and as I wait for any other questions. Yeah. One of the things that
turn on the light, but I can still hear you.
Sure. One of the things that narrative is perhaps argued to be needed for is like self-concern, like concern for yourself. It's one of the things Shechtman originally, I think in her, like in Constitution of Selves, this is one of the characteristics of, you know, human beings, which require narrativity to be endorsed, self-concern, along with other things she mentioned. Although, of course, she has changed her position quite a lot, like in personal life view, she has a completely different approach, and I'm not quite sure where narrativity falls in that approach. So she might have actually given up on the notion, but what would you think about in lacking a narrative approach, how would self-concern be possible? That's the one I have most difficulty with, to be honest. Although I think maybe you could say in the moment that you are, like in the musician case, you already have the concerns you have because of whatever has happened before. So in that sense, perhaps it could be said that self-concern is still possible in lack of narrativity, but maybe there is a better way to articulate it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, as regards Maria Schechtman, in her last book, she says she gives up on the word narrative. She actually says it's just not really the word I want at all. Just having some sense of structure or in your life, I think she says. I can't remember the details. Somewhere I did review it, and so I could look that up, but I can't do it now. Well, secondly, again, you know, pressing the point of the actual full meaning of the word narrative, that if you might think that you need something, you might realize that you're out of concern for yourself, you know, for your flourishing, you might think that you need something. Is that already automatically narrative? That's one question. You might think, well, really, I do. I'm not getting enough sleep, and it's not good for me, and I should get more sleep. If that's going to be counted as already narrative, then yeah, you see. So yeah. I'm going to push it like that. I'm going to demand clarification on what exactly they want and what they mean by. And again, you know, it's good to brush your teeth, and I mean, looking after yourself. Does that require? Is that already intrinsically narrative?
So, I mean, I wouldn't want to say so.
Yes.
But one might push, perhaps say, you know, you want to buy a house, so you want to save up some money.
Yes, I mean that life is. Go ahead. No.
Maybe it's possible to kind of bring it down to the brushing your teeth thing at the end of the day, just because the duration is a little longer. It doesn't add narrativity to it.
Well, you're trying to defend me here. Thank you. No, of course, we have long-term projects, and that does look prima facie. It looks like, as it were, a big plus for the narrative. So I go and I want to do a PhD. But again, I'm going to think that narrative people and non-narrative people are going to live that extremely differently. So if the mere having of long-term projects is to be narrative, then then a lot of people are going to come out as narrative. But I'm still going to think there's a very different characteristic ways of living it. Yeah, but it's a good point too. This is another feature that makes you think that some sort of narrativity is essential to a well-lived life. Absolutely. But then, of course, you know, it's not going to be a universal truth, because the happy-go-lucky people, the people who live from day to day, this is another form of possible good life.
Okay, we're coming to an end. Any further questions? There's a phone call.
No, I appreciate the pushback here.
Okay. I just want to ask more things.
Okay.
We have 8 minutes, so.
Oh.
Okay, so this is, I mean, I haven't formulated this question, but it's not really on the normative side either. But in terms of the descriptive sense of what it's like to be non-narrative versus what it's like to be narrative. I'm not exactly sure of this, but it seems to me that there's a deep gap in understanding one another.
Oh, I think so.
And I am worried, perhaps, that deep gap signifies something, that there's something wrong with, but I don't know what. It's not just a matter of not being able to, being difficult to communicate. It seems more than that, although I can't pinpoint what it is. And I get that feeling as, again, when, for instance, discussing this sometimes with my students, it's just, it not only does it not make sense to be non-narrative, but as I said, put aside the normative aspect, even in the descriptive sense, how can you be like non-narrative? I wonder what that deep, I don't know if you feel that deep gap on the both parties trying to understand each other, and whether that's a signal of further.
Well, one of the things that happens is that the thesis gets trivialized again. So they think that, I mean, Davenport or someone, either Davenport or some other guy whose name I can't remember, argue that you have to be narrative to make coffee. So if that's what they're thinking, then of course we all are, but I thought it was meant to be more interesting than that. Or I just think that human life, first of all, I don't think that a marriage isn't going to work if we have a narrative and a non-narrative. I'm sure that I think it's orthogonal with respect to whether relationships go well or not. In fact, it can even be something that each person finds charming in the other person, that they're different in the way that they are. But I do think that we misunderstand each other to an astonishing degree. I'm reading Dickens at the moment, and he's just made the point, that we all think that other people are much more like ourselves than they are. I think appreciation of human difference is a real achievement, and it requires. So all I can say to that is deep, profound misunderstanding. But if you have people in your class saying it doesn't make sense, non-narrative doesn't even make sense, then I think I would expect that's because they've lowered the bar till they think that just living a normal life and getting on the right bus and things like that is, or going to do a degree at a university is already to be narrative. But it has to be more than that to be just a distinctive and deeply interesting thesis.
It's trivial, I see. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well,
for
I enjoyed
great talk.
Yeah, it's helpful. Nice to see you all. So
yeah. Okay.
Maybe one day I'll come to Istanbul in person.
That would be great. Yeah, hope to see you.
I went to Boyazici once. That was nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
When
bye.
is that?
Sorry?
You've been there?
Yes.
When was that?
You gave a talk there. I'm too non-narrative. I do have a self-history, of course. I think it probably more than 10 years ago.
Okay, nice. Okay, everyone. Well, that's kind of that's the end today for our Philosophy Talk series. We'll have our 6th one. That's like the 2nd one this term I think on November. Let me double check. Eric Olson is going to give a talk.
Oh,
yeah.
Right, good.
25th. Yeah, 25, November 25. So, I mean, we're going to be making those announcements again. So please check those out and hope to see you another time. Thank you again.
Bye-bye.